Good day, everyone. So our group decided to validate the accuracy and consistency of the result on our chosen thesis project entitled Contribution of Ecotourism in Barangay Mabua, Surigao City.
As to the profile of participants, we found out that out of 150 respondents, 33 of them, or 22%, are 18 to 24 years old. 37 or 24.76% are 25 to 29 years old, and 80 or 53.33% are 30 years old and above. As to gender, 84 or 56% of the total participants are male and 66 of 44% are females. As to civil status, 51 or 34% are single, 78 or 52% are married, 9 or 6% are separated, and 12 or 8% are widowed. As to the sector, 15 or 10% of the total participants are employed in the government, 43 or 28.67% are self-employed, 26 or 17.33% are private employees, and 66 or 44% are unemployed. As to the number of years in residency, 2 or 1.33% live in 5 to 10 years, and 148 or 98.67 lives for 11 years and above. Furthermore, as to the highest educational attainment, there are 28 or 18.67% of the total participants are elementary graduates, 75 or 50% are high school graduates, 37 or 24.67% are college graduates, and 10 or 6.67% are on the other educational attainments.
Presented in Table 3, the first statement, local resident disposed waste in designated trash site, got the highest mean of 3.87 and the standard deviation of 0.37, with verbal interpretation of strongly agree and qualitative description of high contribution. On the other hand, the fourth statement, local residents and visitors are encouraged to use biodegradable materials, got the lowest mean of 2.91 and the standard deviation of 0.69 with the verbal interpretation of agree and the qualitative description of moderate contribution. We were not able to get sufficient data for our chosen thesis project, but when we validated the average mean and standard deviation using Minitab, we noticed an error, particularly on how they calculated the average of standard deviation. Environmental conservation got the average mean of 3.53 with the standard deviation of 0.55 and verbally interpreted as strongly agree with a qualitative description of high contribution. They miscalculated the average of standard deviation, which must be 0.55.
As presented in Table 4, the first statement, which is safety and security has improved, got the highest mean of 3.81 and the standard deviation of 0.46 with verbal interpretation of strongly agree and qualitative description of high contribution. On the other hand, the last statement, which is local residents are being requested to produce souvenirs and products, got the highest lowest mean of 1.92 and the standard deviation of 0.84 with a verbal interpretation of disagree and qualitative description of low contribution. We were not able to get sufficient data as what we have stated from a chosen thesis project, but when we validated their average mean and standard deviation using the Minitab, we noticed the same error, particularly on how they calculated the average of standard deviation. So generally, well-being of the local people got the average mean of 3.11 with a standard deviation of 0.71 and verbally interpreted as agree with a qualitative description of moderate contribution. So they miscalculated the average of standard deviation, which must be 0.71.
As presented in Table 5, the fifth statement, which bring basic understanding of conservation values of ecotourism, got the highest mean of 3.52 and the standard deviation of 0.59 with verbal interpretation of strongly agree and qualitative description of high contribution. On the other hand, Statement 3 brings information through brochures, website, and newspapers get the highest lowest mean of 1.57 and the standard deviation of 0.73 with the verbal interpretation of disagree and the qualitative description of low contribution. We are not be able to get sufficient data from our chosen thesis project, but when we validated their average mean and the standard deviation using the Minitab, we noticed the same error again the first and the second indicators, particularly on the average of standard deviation. Generally, interpretation and education get the average mean of 2.79 with a standard deviation of 0.68 and verbally interpreted as agree with a qualitative description of moderate contribution. They miscalculated again the average of standard deviation, which must be 0.68.
As to the analysis of variance, we cannot verify and compare the result of the actual thesis due to insufficient raw data that could support the process. However, the interpretation of the result is still the same.
Based on the table presented, there is a significant difference in the contribution of ecotourism in Barangay Maba with respect to age. As shown, it obtained the p-value environmental conservation of 0.0011, well-being of the local people of 0.0110, and interpretation on education of 0.0172. This means that the decision on the null hypothesis should be rejected because they were lower than 0.05. There is a significant difference in age concerning environmental conservation, well-being of local people, interpretation, and education because the older ones are more concerned in taking care of environment than the younger ones.
On Table 8, there is a significant difference in the contribution of ecotourism in Barangay Maba with respect to sex. It obtained the p-value of the well-being of local people of 0.0464 and interpretation and education of 0.000316, meaning the decision of the null hypothesis should be rejected because of this lower than 0.05. Therefore, there is a significant difference in sex concerning on well-being of local people, interpretation and education because female participants were more concerned in taking good care of the environment than the male.
Based on Table 9, there is a significant difference in the contribution of ecotourism in Barangay Maba with respect to civil status. As shown, it obtained the p-value on the environmental conservation of 0.0058, well-being of local people of 0.0057, and interpretation of education of 0.0021. Meaning, the decision in the null hypothesis should be rejected for a reason that these were lower than 0.05. There is a significant difference in civil status concerning on environmental conservation, well-being of the local people, interpretation and education, because married people are more concerned in the environment than the unmarried ones.
Based on Table 10, there is a significant difference in the contribution of ecotourism in Barangay Maba with respect to employment. As illustrated, it obtained a p-value on the well-being of local people of 0.0019 and the interpretation of education of 0.001. This means that the decision on the null hypothesis should be rejected because they were lower than 0.05. There is a significant difference in employment concerning on well-being to local people, interpretation and education because ecotourism contributed differently with people who have different businesses.
Based on Table 11, there is a significant difference in the contribution of ecotourism in Barangay Maba with respect to residency. The result of p-value in the environmental conservation is 0.0180. This means that the decision of the null hypothesis shall be rejected because these were lower than 0.05. This is the significant difference in the environmental conservation concerning on residency, for a reason that the people who live longer, they have been conserving the environment for the long term.
Based on Table 12, there is a significant difference in the contribution of ecotourism in Barangay Mabwa with respect to highest educational attainment. As shown in the table, the result of p-value for environmental conservation is 0.01832. Well-being of local people is 0.2675. Interpretation and education is 0.1568. It can be gleaned from the result that the decision on the null hypothesis should be not rejected because these were higher than 0.05.
The findings. There were 150 participants involved in the study. 56% of the participants were males and 44% were females. Most of them belonged to 30 above with 53.33%. As to the highest educational attainment, 50% of them were high school graduates. As to the age, 80% of the participants were 30 years old above. It means that the most of the participants who contributed from the ecotourism were at age 30 and above. It shows that there were a significant difference in the age contribution of ecotourism in terms of age, gender, civil status, sector, and residency.
Conclusion. Based on the findings and result of our chosen study, the contribution of the ecotourism resources to the resident of Barangay Mawa, particularly in their locality, made an impact, thus seen in their economic status. However, there has much to be done and observed in the locality, especially in the aspects of educating